Hi, this is Patrick Conroy, and we're up to Chapter 6, Public Opinion and Political Action. Now, the first part of the chapter emphasizes that we are an immigrant society or a nation of nations. You know, even Native Americans, at some point, their ancestors came to this country. Most of us are much more recent. Um, and a million legal immigrants every year, 500,000 illegal immigrants a year. I'm not too sure those numbers are correct right now. Um, this was back in 2020, last time there was a census. 13.7% of current US residents were foreign born. That will include people who are here legally and illegally, and some of those are citizens. There have been different immigration waves that have come into this country. First wave, we'll say Northwest Europe, really began with English people. Irish, Germans, and Scandinavians came in a little bit later. When they came in, they faced huge discrimination um, and a lot of rhetoric. Back then, they considered Irish, Germans, and Scandinavians separate races from English. And the Irish, they were very suspect because they were Catholic. And there was a lot of anti-Catholic feeling. They said these people will never understand democracy or the principles that are important to our country. Well, they don't say that anymore because they were assimilated. Same thing when other groups came over. This was more after World War One and World War Two with Italians, Jews, Poles, and Russians. That's when they came over. Right now, most of our immigration is from Central and South America and Cuba. That's Latinos, Asians, Vietnam, Korea, China, India, and elsewhere. So what sometimes they use the term melting pot. People come from all over. They are assimilated into our culture, but they're also influencing our culture. And so we're creating a unique culture from many different cultures. You might hear the term minority, majority. I don't really like that term because I think it can be very misleading. There are some um, projections that say by I think 2060, if you add up all the different minorities, they will be more than 51% of the population. I just don't think that says much because a lot of those, it doesn't mean that they are form one block or agree with each other or one uniform form thing. It's just, you know, an immigrant from Honduras can be very different from an immigrant from Cuba or from Vietnam. One large group that did not come about voluntarily were African Americans who descended from slaves. And there's still differences. 18% of those people still live in poverty, as opposed to 7.7% of white people who live in poverty. But political power is increasing among this group. And as culture changes, more assimilation, it doesn't mean that we're the same country that we were, but everything's changing. And part of that is different cultures being brought into our country. Regional shift. For much of our country's history, the Northeast was the most populous. That's where the ports were, so that's where people came in, and also that was where the most industry, hiring factory, and those were jobs that immigrants could have. So those became the most populous areas. Um, Now there changes, demographic changes associated with political changes. A lot more people moving to Texas, Florida, Louisiana, we're losing population. Um, that every decade there's a census, and then they look at the state of represent, the Congress. Every every state gets two senators, but depending on whether the population has changed, we might lose or gain a state representative. I mean, a congressional representative in the House of Representatives, and that also changes our electoral vote. People over 65 are the fastest growing age group. Those baby boomers always ahead of us. And people are living longer. The fertility rate is lower, meaning people are having fewer children. And there are all sorts of reasons for that. And that's kind of worldwide. Implications for Social Security. As more people require Social Security and fewer people are going into the workforce because the fertility rate is lower, that's going to cause problems. But it's also very politically sensitive. How do you tell someone who's 68, hey, you can't count on this money anymore that you've been putting money into your whole life? So, how does political socialization occur? Well, the family, especially for young people, plays a central role. That's where most of your time and your emotional commitment when you're young is around your family. So you're most likely to pick up political attitudes from your parents and your brothers and sisters. It's people you know. Um, my family came from a big family. We're all across the political spectrum. The mass media, because they are sort of a parent as well. And that can mean anything from television shows to news. And there is definitely an age gap in people who follow politics. Older people are more likely to follow politics than younger people. And schools can shape ideas of civic virtues. Other things that will play a process are your family or your friends. Not so much you might not, just because your friend is saying something, you might not necessarily believe it 100%, but you might check out their viewpoints or listen to them because they are your friend. Also, if you meet people from different backgrounds and hear their stories, your political opinions might change based on that. Um, as people get older, they're more likely to participate. They're more affected by the economy and changing things going on with policy, and so they are, have a greater reason to vote. And party identification strengthens. You might start out as one party, switch to another party, and then you become deeper and deeper involved with that politics. Political behavior is learned. No one is born a Democrat or born a Republican. It's something that they develop over their lifetime. Okay, measuring public opinion. How are polls conducted? What role do polls play in American democracy? What polls reveal about American information and the decline of trust in government? We'll be going over these. Okay, so how are polls conducted? Well, they can't ask everybody in the country, a question. So they have to rely on samples. And random sampling means that they just randomly select people. And then you give those opinions. Those can be very difficult to really gauge the population. There's more targeted polling where say they are 20% of the population is over 65. What then those polls will do is they will make sure that poll answers come from 20% of the population over 65. Those are a little bit more direct. There's always a sampling error. And they usually put that in the poll results. Random digit dialing, very random. And I don't trust it because I know that if I don't know the number calling me, I don't answer. Internet polling, the most unreliable source. um, because then people can volunteer for the poll, and people who are strong have a stronger opinion are more likely to vote in that poll. And and they're saying to their friends on Facebook, "Hey, everybody vote in this poll." So it maybe gets a lot of responses, but it doesn't mean that it's representative of the population as a whole. There are pros and cons of relying on polls to decide policy, even gauging opinion between elections. And you know, should should a politician take a position based on what was in the polls? Are they shaping opinion or are they pandering to opinion? Exit polls. Exit polls are when there's an election and they poll the people coming out of the election. Those can be very tricky because if they're giving the results while the election is going on, it might influence voting behavior of those people who haven't voted. More like, okay, I can see my candidates well ahead in the exit polling, and it's raining, so I'm not going to bother to vote. Well, then the election goes the other way. The wording of questions is crucial. You know, it's very easy to ask leading questions, so you'll get the answer you want. This is just a political cartoon. Wife has asked, "Do these pants make me fat? Look fat?" Well, how are you going to answer that? Are you going to answer that honestly, or are you going to answer that in a way that won't get you beat up? What polls do have revealed is that there's often a low level of political knowledge. People might know one side of an issue, but not the other side, or may vaguely know of an issue, or they're just not really paying attention. Younger people tend to be the most uninformed. Hopefully, after this class, you'll be more informed. Who's the responsibility for the ill-informed electorate? Is it the school's fault, or is it media's fault, or is it their own fault, or is it government's fault? Um, the more you hear about politics, the less you're interested in it. It's kind of the paradox of mass politics. Then there's the decline in trust of government. It's sort of built up over time. First, with the Vietnam War, I mean, there's always been distrust. I don't know where they say it begins with the Vietnam War. Always distrust of every government in every country. But it really started to take center stage in this country with the Vietnam War. Um, that's because it was clear that the government was lying to people about the war, about the progress that we were making, and why we were over there. Then Watergate. Watergate was a scandal because the sitting president, who was running up for re-election, ordered bugs to be placed in the opposing candidate's headquarters and used that information to shape his campaign. Well, it might not have been as bad if they didn't try so hard to cover it up. And they tried so hard to cover it up that the more it became a scandal. And they realized, hey, some of these people in government can't be trusted to tell you the truth or not to hurt you. Then various issues with the economy in the 70s and the Iran hostage crisis. Um, didn't feel that the government was doing enough. Didn't feel like we were getting the full story. Less trust in government. And COVID. Well, the lockdown really affected people. Many people believed that the government was not telling the whole story or that the government overreacted and infringed on civil liberties. To some extent, public cynicism is good. It can have a negative impact, though, especially on whether there's support for social programs. If you believe that money going to social programs is not being spent properly, you're more inclined to try to cut it off for every program, throw out the good with the bad. Ideologies help to organize how we think about politics. That there's liberal ideology and conservative ideology, and those ideas have changed over time. 37% of Americans identify as conservative, 24% identify as liberal. So that leaves a lot out there they don't really relate to either. And ideologies can vary among groups. Young people, African Americans, and women are those who tend to be more liberal. Some could say that they've experienced depression and are more likely to want to have the government step in to take care of oppression. Groups that already have political clout tend to be more conservative. They like the status quo. It has treated them well. Social class isn't as predictive as it used to be. It used to be like, okay, the rich are always going to vote this way, the poor are always going to vote that way. Not at all as certain. Saying you belong to a certain religion might give some clues into your ideology, but not as much as saying how often or frequently or how important your religion is to you. So that's what religiosity is. Conventional participation, these are the usual ways: voting, running for office, collecting signatures for a petition, donating to political causes. Less conventional participation is protesting, and we're seeing a lot of protests going on both sides, conservative and liberal, protesting different things that they disagree with. Civil disobedience is one step above that. That's if you don't believe in a law, you don't abide by that law. And this can be very effective as well. There have been things that were terrible, like segregation and Rosa Parks getting onto a whites only bus seat on the bus. Well, that was civil disobedience. But it's an open flouting of the law. It's openly saying, I am not going to follow this law, not just breaking the law and trying to hide it. And then violence. Violence in this country, committing violence to support your cause is going to backfire. People see violence, whichever side does it, it turns off the majority of Americans. And there are terrible, and it's hard to say whether this is true or not true. There's always a fear that one group will be infiltrated by people who have a different opinion, who then cause trouble and cause violence to make the group that they're pretending to be and look bad. Protests can draw attention. You get lots of news coverage. You get your opinion out there. Civil disobedience, that can have great effect. It can also turn people off. Violence, that is really not a winner. It's going to turn more people off than get to your opinion, get to your thing. So we have here examples of nonviolent civil disobedience: sitting at the Walmart counter that were segregated at the time and laying in for Black Lives Matter. Class inequality and participation. The higher socioeconomic status, they're more likely to vote. Minorities, they are voting at a similar rate. So socioeconomic status can be an indicator of whether someone's going to vote. Whether they're a minority or not is not. The Latino and Asian Americans voter turnout historically has been lower. So what happens when there's less participation? Well, the people who do vote, politicians are going to do what they want. Unfortunately, it also means that the more the people give to a campaign financially, the more their voice is heard. And that is a shame. In the public guide towards the scope of government, people are always asking, do you want the government to do more or less? Most of the time during peacetime, they're like, hey, we want the government out of our lives. We don't want a government. We just want to go on with our days and nights. But it can be inconsistent. Like, oh, we want less government, but we want to outlaw these things. Well, that means more government action. So do you really want less government? You just want less government in other parts of your life. Like you want less regulation of industry, but maybe more regulation in people's personal lives. Same thing can go back and forth with liberals and conservatives. And it can be, gridlock where when both sides say they won't compromise, but nobody has a clear majority, it's just gridlock and nobody gets anything. Okay, so that wraps up this presentation. Enjoy your week. Talk to you soon.